On the day I officially retired after 42 long years as a nurse, I gave my daughter what I believed was the most meaningful gift of my life. It was a handcrafted memory box, filled to the brim with old photos, personal letters, and tokens of a lifetime spent loving her. She opened it right there in front of the whole family, glanced inside, and rolled her eyes. Then she let out a soft scoff and said, "Mom, this is literally just a box of junk." The entire room fell dead silent. I forced a smile onto my face, desperate to hide how completely heartbroken I was. But in that exact moment, a painful realization hit me. My daughter didn't value a single thing I had spent my life giving her. A few days later, I used my will to quietly give her my answer. Before we move on, I want to hear from you. Have you ever given someone your whole heart, only to realize they didn't appreciate it at all? Let me know in the comments. If stories about family dynamics and unexpected twists resonate with you, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out. Also, let me know where you are watching from and what time it is over there. I always love seeing how far these stories travel and how they connect people from all over the world. My name is Monica Dunn. For most of my life, I believed that love was measured by sacrifice, not flowers. Not by grand promises or expensive gifts, but by sacrifice. The kind where you quietly give up pieces of your own life just so someone else can have a better one. When I was 25, my husband Michael lost his life in a highway accident just outside Columbus, Ohio. One second, I was a wife planning a family trip. The next, I was a widow standing by a hospital bed, trying to understand how a perfectly healthy man could just vanish from my future in a single afternoon. Our daughter, Lauren, was only 8 years old. I remember looking at her sleeping face that night and making a silent promise. No matter how hard things got, she would never feel abandoned. I would carry the weight for both of us. Back then, I truly believed love could fix anything. What I didn't know was that sometimes, loving unconditionally can make you completely blind. The years after Michael passed away were a blur of pure exhaustion. I worked as a nurse at Riverside Methodist Hospital. My shifts were long, and the money never seemed to go far enough. Some weeks I worked 6 days straight. Other weeks I picked up every bit of overtime I could get. I can't count how many nights I spent walking hospital corridors while other mothers were reading bedtime stories. I missed school concerts, soccer games, and birthday parties. Every single absence left a scar on my heart. But I kept telling myself it was temporary. I was building a future for Lauren. Whenever the guilt started to consume me, I would look at her sleeping peacefully in her room and remind myself why I was doing this. She never complained. At least, not when she was little. Lauren was a bright kid, sharp, funny, and beautiful. She was the kind of little girl who could make a stranger smile without even trying. Teachers loved her, neighbors adored her, and I loved her more than life itself. Every decision I made revolved around her future. When friends encouraged me to start dating again, I said no. When my mother suggested I deserved another chance at happiness, I said no. When coworkers invited me on trips or out to social gatherings, I usually said no to those too. My life became incredibly simple. Work, home, Lauren, day after day. The years flew by, and Lauren grew into an impressive young woman. She excelled in school and got into Ohio State University. I still remember standing in her empty bedroom after helping her move into her dorm. I sat on her bed and cried. Not because I was sad, but because I was so incredibly proud. Every single sacrifice suddenly felt worth it. I thought the hardest years were behind us. But I was wrong. College was expensive, much more than I had anticipated. I took on even more shifts, sold the jewelry Michael had given me, and drained most of my savings. For months at a time, I barely bought a thing for myself. My shoes were worn out, my car needed constant repairs, and my fridge was usually empty. But Lauren never knew. Honestly, I didn't want her to. Parents aren't supposed to pass their burdens down to their children. At least, that's what I thought at the time. When Lauren graduated, I sat in the very front row. I cried through the entire ceremony. The woman sitting next to me probably thought I was losing it, but that diploma represented thousands of unseen sacrifices. The late-night shifts, the missed holidays, and the lonely nights had all led to that exact moment. After graduation, Lauren landed a marketing job in Cincinnati. Her career took off fast. Within a few years, she was making more money than I ever had in my entire life, and I was thrilled for her. She deserved that success. When she married Ethan Mitchell, I welcomed him into our family with open arms. Ethan was kind, respected, and grounded, the type of man who listened more than he spoke. I liked him from the start. When their son, Noah, was born, my heart was full all over again. Becoming a grandmother felt like a second chance at joy. Whenever they needed help, I was there to babysit. I drove Noah to school, watched his baseball games, and picked him up whenever Lauren was too busy. Sometimes I wondered if I was making myself too available, too eager to please. But I never let that thought linger for long. Family helps family. That was just how I was raised. Then, subtle changes started happening. At first, they were so small I could easily ignore them. Reaching Lauren on the phone became harder. The conversations got shorter, the visits home became rare, and everything felt rushed. Whenever I talked about my life, she seemed completely distracted. But whenever she talked about hers, she expected my full, undivided attention. In the beginning, I blamed it on adult life. People get busy, careers are demanding, and families get complicated. I understood that. I had been through it myself. But as time went on, something deeper started to bother me. It wasn't just that Lauren was giving me less of her time. It felt like she had less interest in me as a person. There is a big difference between the two. One afternoon, I spent nearly an hour telling her about a difficult patient I had been caring for. When I finally finished, she looked up from her phone and said, "Sorry, Mom, what were you saying?" It felt like a small thing, and maybe it was, but those moments started happening more and more often. Another time, I invited her over for dinner. She canceled 30 minutes before she was supposed to arrive, and then later that night, I saw pictures online of her out grabbing drinks with her friends. Once again, I told myself not to overreact. Once again, I made excuses for her. Once again, I chose to be understanding. That's just what mothers do. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. Then came my 67th birthday. Lauren forgot it. Not entirely. She remembered 3 days later. She called me while driving somewhere and said, "Oh my gosh, Mom, I am so sorry. Things have just been incredibly chaotic lately." I laughed it off and told her it was fine. But after I hung up, I sat alone in my kitchen, staring at the birthday cake my friend Patricia Collins had brought over for me. A forgotten birthday shouldn't have mattered that much. But somehow it did, because it wasn't really about the date. It was about the feeling of being completely invisible. That feeling started to stick with me. It wasn't every day or even every week, but it happened often enough that I couldn't ignore it anymore. As my retirement grew closer, I found myself hoping that this milestone would bring Lauren and me closer again. I imagined family dinners, weekend visits, and deep, long conversations. I pictured finally having the time to enjoy the people I had spent decades working for, especially my daughter. I had absolutely no idea that retirement was about to reveal a truth I had spent years refusing to face. I never could have guessed that the person who would break my heart wasn't a stranger, or a difficult patient, or a tough coworker, or even life itself. It was the little girl I had spent 42 years loving more than myself. And the worst part was, up until that moment, I genuinely believed she loved me just the same. As my final day of work approached, I found myself thinking less about the future and much more about the past. Maybe that's just what happens when you reach the end of a long career. You stop measuring life by what you are currently building, and you start looking at what you've already established. For me, that meant looking back at 42 years as a nurse and 42 years as a mom. Those two roles defined me. Both had completely drained me at times, but both had given my life real meaning. A month before my retirement party, Patricia Collins was sitting across from me at my kitchen table sipping coffee. Patricia had been my closest friend for over 30 years. She had been there through my grief, my financial struggles, my health scares, and every single stage of motherhood. If anyone truly knew my heart, it was Patricia. "You look like you're a million miles away," she said. I smiled, just thinking. "That's a dangerous hobby," she joked. "I want to do something special for Lauren." Patricia raised an eyebrow. "For your retirement?" I nodded. "Not exactly." She waited for me to go on. I looked out the kitchen window. "Do you know what I realized recently?" "What's that?" "Lauren doesn't actually know my story." Patricia looked confused. "Of course she does." "No," I said softly. "She knows the facts. She doesn't know the story." There is a huge difference. Lauren knew I worked as a nurse. She knew I raised her by myself. She knew life was tough after Michael died. But knowing the facts and truly understanding the sacrifice are two completely different things. She had never actually seen the countless choices that shaped her life. From her point of view, her opportunities always seemed to come naturally. She never saw the cost. Honestly, that wasn't her fault. I purposely hid the cost from her. I wanted her to feel secure as a child, and I wanted her to have a hopeful future. I never wanted her to carry the weight of my struggles. But now, with retirement right around the corner, I felt a deep longing to share those memories. Not because I wanted praise or sympathy, but because I wanted a real connection. I wanted my daughter to understand the woman I was outside of just being her mother. That conversation planted a seed in my mind. A few days later, I drove to a craft store, then to another one, and then to a little shop downtown. Over the next few weeks, I quietly gathered materials: wood, decorative paper, photographs, envelopes, ribbons, and boxes. The project took up almost all of my free time, and it was the first time in years I felt genuinely excited about something. The centerpiece of it all was going to be that handcrafted memory box. It wasn't anything expensive or flashy, but it was deeply meaningful, at least to me. I started with the photographs. There were hundreds of them. Some were kept safe in albums, others were tucked away in drawers and closets, and a few had been hidden inside books for years. I spread them all out across the dining room table. There were pictures of Lauren as a baby, Lauren learning to ride a bike, Lauren dressed up as a princess for Halloween, Lauren holding her very first report card, her graduation day, and Lauren holding Noah right after he was born. Every single picture held a story, and every story carried a sacrifice. As I sorted through them, the memories came rushing back. I remembered sleeping in the hospital break room because I couldn't afford a babysitter on certain nights. I remembered eating peanut butter sandwiches for weeks straight just so Lauren could go on her school field trips. I remembered crying in my car after paying her tuition bills, having no idea how I was going to cover the mortgage. But I never regretted those choices. Not once. Because every single difficult moment was connected to something beautiful. My daughter. Still, photos alone weren't enough. I wanted Lauren to hear my voice, not literally but emotionally. So I started writing letters. Some were just a page long, while others went on for several pages. I wrote about her childhood, about Michael, about my dreams for her, and about the fears I had never shared with anyone. I wrote about the intense pride I felt watching her become a mother herself. One night, I stayed up writing until nearly midnight. By the time I finished, tears had smudged the ink on the paper. I sat alone in the living room, holding the letter in my hands. For a second, I thought about throwing it away. It felt way too personal, too vulnerable. But then I thought about how Lauren and I spent all our time talking about schedules, responsibilities, and logistics. Maybe vulnerability was exactly what we were missing. So, I kept going. By the end of the month, the box held more than 20 letters. Then I added another layer: old keepsakes. My hospital badge from my very first nursing job, newspaper clippings from when Lauren won academic awards, a tiny ballet shoe from her childhood dance classes, the ticket stubs from the only mother-daughter vacation we ever took, tiny objects that carried massive memories. Every single item represented a chapter of the life we had built together. However, there was one last item that I hadn't shown to a single soul. Not even Patricia had seen it. It was a key. A small brass key attached to a silver chain. It looked simple, ordinary, and easy to overlook, but its meaning was immense. Years ago, after finally paying off my mortgage, I bought a modest little cabin by a lake in northern Ohio. It wasn't luxurious or worth millions, but it was beautiful, peaceful, and private. It was the kind of place meant to bring a family together, the kind of place where grandkids could build lifelong memories. I had quietly taken care of it for years, paying the taxes, handling the repairs, and keeping up with maintenance. Eventually, I made a final decision. One day, this cabin would belong to Lauren. I hadn't told her yet, not because it was a secret, but because I wanted the moment to be truly special. The key inside the memory box symbolized that future. It represented trust, legacy, and family, everything I hoped to leave behind. As the day of the party grew closer, I got more and more excited, maybe even more than I should have been. I kept picturing Lauren opening the box, looking at the photos, reading the letters, and perhaps understanding for the very first time what it actually took to build the life she had. I imagined the tears, the laughter, and the hugs. Maybe we would spend the whole evening talking through those memories. Maybe we would reconnect and finally be close again. The closer the party got, the more I allowed myself to believe in those possibilities. A week before the retirement celebration, Lauren called. She sounded completely distracted and busy, just like usual. "Mom, what do you want for your retirement gift?" she asked. I smiled. "I don't need anything." "Come on, seriously?" she sighed. "You always say that." Because it was the truth. I never needed expensive gifts or luxury items. The things I actually wanted couldn't be bought in a store. I wanted time, connection, love, and respect, the exact things that money can never guarantee. After we hung up, I looked over at the memory box sitting on the dining room table. It was finished, ready, and waiting quietly. The wood caught the light beautifully. The letters were neatly arranged, the photos were organized in chronological order, and the brass key rested inside a small velvet pouch. Everything was absolutely perfect. At least that's what I thought. What I didn't know was that Lauren had a completely different set of expectations for my retirement celebration. She was anticipating something much bigger, something of high material value, things measured in dollars rather than memories. When the moment finally arrived, the massive divide between what I was giving and what she actually wanted would change everything between us. On the morning of the retirement party, my emotions felt all over the place. I had envisioned this day for years. 42 years of 12-hour shifts, 42 holidays spent inside hospital walls, 42 years of comforting strangers while quietly carrying my own grief. Now it was all over. For the first time since I was 25, I didn't have anywhere I absolutely had to be on Monday morning. No alarms, no patient charts, no emergency calls, just freedom. At least, that's what everyone else called it. Yet, as I stood in front of the bathroom mirror adjusting my pearl earrings that morning, freedom wasn't what I felt. I felt incredibly nervous, like a teenager getting ready for a first date. It wasn't the party itself that was making me anxious. It was the memory box. For weeks, I had been imagining Lauren's reaction. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. Expectations can be dangerous things. The higher they get, the harder they fall. But I couldn't help myself. I loved my daughter, and deep down, a tiny part of me held onto a flicker of hope that she would finally understand everything I had never said out loud. The party was held in a private room at a restaurant right along the Scioto River in Columbus. A handful of former coworkers, neighbors, and family members were there. Patricia arrived early to help set things up. When she saw me carrying the memory box, she smiled. "This is it," I nodded. "This is it." She placed a hand on my shoulder. "She's going to absolutely love it." I smiled back. "I hope so." Looking back now, those words still sting. I hope so, because I genuinely did. Throughout the evening, the memory box sat right beside my chair, wrapped carefully in cream-colored paper and tied with a silver ribbon. It wasn't extravagant, just elegant, meaningful, and deeply personal. The exact kind of gift I valued most. The night started out beautifully. My former nursing supervisor gave a wonderful speech, several coworkers shared stories, and the room was filled with laughter and a few tears. Even I wiped away a few tears of my own. When they presented me with a plaque honoring my decades of service, the room stood up for a round of applause. For a few moments I felt completely seen, appreciated, and valued, not just as someone's mother or someone's widow, but as Monica Dunn, a woman who had dedicated her entire life to taking care of others. It was one of the happiest moments I had experienced in years. Then Lauren arrived. She wasn't late, but she definitely wasn't early either. She walked in holding an expensive handbag, actively talking on her phone. Ethan followed closely behind her, with Noah coming in right after them. Like always, Ethan immediately greeted everyone warmly. Noah ran right over to give me a big hug, but Lauren remained entirely distracted. "Sorry," she said as she finally hung up her phone. "Work has been completely insane." I smiled. "It's okay." Because that's what mothers say. It's okay, even when it really isn't. During the entire dinner, Lauren kept constantly checking her phone. I tried my best not to notice, and I tried not to let it ruin my mood. People have busy lives and heavy responsibilities. Still, every single glance she gave her screen felt like a reminder that something else was always more important than the moment we were currently sharing. After dessert was served, Patricia stood up and raised her glass. "I think Monica deserves one more special moment tonight." The room erupted into cheers. Patricia pointed right at the gift. "Open your present." My heart immediately started racing. This was the moment. The entire reason I had spent weeks writing letters and gathering memories. I carefully picked up the wrapped box. "Lauren," I said softly, "this is actually for you." She looked genuinely surprised. "For me?" I nodded. "Yes." The room grew quiet as everyone watched. Lauren gave a polite smile and took the package. For a split second, that hope rushed back. Maybe this would go exactly the way I had pictured it. Maybe this was exactly what we both needed. Lauren untied the ribbon, pulled off the wrapping paper, and lifted the wooden lid. The very first thing she saw was a photograph. A picture of her at 6 years old, missing her front teeth and holding a stuffed rabbit. It was one of my absolute favorites. She stared at it for a brief second, then picked up one of the letters, then another, and then the next. Her expression began to change. It wasn't an expression of emotion or gratitude, but rather confusion, followed quickly by impatience. The room remained completely quiet as everyone waited and watched. I watched too, and my smile slowly began to fade away. Lauren flipped through a few more photos, looked at the velvet pouch, opened it, and examined the brass key. Then, she looked up at me and rolled her eyes. She actually rolled her eyes. For a second, I thought I was imagining things. I must have misread her reaction. There was no way my own daughter would react like that. Not here, not now, and not after everything. But then, she let out a soft chuckle. It wasn't a happy laugh, it was entirely dismissive. And then she said the words, "I will never forget." "Mom, this is literally just a box of junk." Dead silence hit the room. Absolute, total silence. You could have heard a fork drop on the floor. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Patricia stared directly at Lauren, and Ethan's face instantly tightened up. Even Noah looked visibly uncomfortable. My heart sank so fast it felt like a physical reaction, like falling right into a pool of ice water. I looked down at the photos inside the box, the ones I had spent hours organizing. The letters that held literal pieces of my soul. The memories I had protected for decades. Junk, that was all she saw, just junk. I forced myself to smile. Because what else could I do? Cry? Start an argument? Beg her to understand? No, I just smiled. "Oh," I said. "Well, maybe it means a bit more to me than it does to you." Lauren shrugged her shoulders. "I mean, it's nice, it's just..." She hesitated and let out another small laugh. "I don't know, I guess I expected something else." Something else. Those two words echoed in my mind. Something else. The key to the cabin suddenly made perfect sense. The confusion on her face suddenly made perfect sense. She hadn't been hoping for memories, she had been expecting value. Financial value. Something tangible, expensive, and measurable. The realization hit me right in the chest. While I had spent weeks preparing a gift filled with love, Lauren had clearly spent weeks expecting a payday. Ethan quickly stepped in to break the tension. He picked up one of the letters. "This is actually really incredible," he said, and his voice sounded completely genuine, deeply genuine. "You made this whole thing yourself." I nodded. "It definitely took some time." "I can tell." Patricia spoke up next. "I think it's absolutely beautiful." The rest of the room quickly joined in, and the tension slowly started to lift. People went back to talking, and the evening moved forward. But something fundamental had shifted inside me. It wasn't obvious on the outside, but deep down a painful crack had formed, and no amount of polite conversation was going to fix it. The rest of the party passed by in a complete blur. I smiled, took photos with people, accepted hugs, and played the exact role everyone expected of me. But behind every single smile, the same questions kept spinning. Why? Why did Lauren react that way? What happened to the little girl who used to cherish handwritten notes and family traditions? When did memories become completely worthless to her? When did I become someone she simply tolerated? Eventually, the party came to an end. The guests began to leave, saying their goodbyes and sharing final hugs. The room slowly emptied out. As I packed up my things to leave, I honestly believed the worst part of the night was over. I figured the humiliation of that moment would be the deepest wound. I was completely wrong. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, I would accidentally overhear a conversation that would reveal something far more painful than a simple rolled eye. Something that would force me to question everything I thought I knew about my daughter. The retirement party wrapped up officially around 9 o'clock. By then, most of the guests had headed home, and the restaurant staff was busy clearing off the tables. Patricia hugged me 3 separate times before she finally left. Even Noah threw his arms around me and whispered, "I really liked the box, Grandma." Those few words meant more to me than he could ever understand, but unfortunately, they couldn't undo what had already happened. The drive home should have felt peaceful. Instead, I replayed Lauren's reaction over and over again in my mind. The rolled eyes, the smirk, the disappointment, and those words, just a box of junk. Every single time I thought about it, another piece of my heart fractured. Even then, I found myself trying to defend her. Maybe she was just exhausted. Maybe she was stressed out with work. Maybe I was just being overly sensitive. Mothers have a natural talent for making excuses for their children, even when those children are 42 years old. I got back to my house just after 10 o'clock, completely drained and emotionally empty, ready to just put the whole night behind me. I changed into some comfortable clothes and started organizing a few of the gifts people had given me: a coffee mug, some books, gift cards, and flowers. Standard retirement presents. As I was putting things away, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Patricia. "Are you doing okay?" I stared at the message for a few seconds before typing back, "I'm fine." The lie sat right there on the screen. I almost deleted it, but instead I hit send. Admitting the truth would make it too real, and I just wasn't ready to face reality yet. About 15 minutes later, I realized something. My purse wasn't anywhere in the house. I checked the kitchen, the bedroom, and the living room. Nothing. A sinking feeling hit my stomach. I had left it back at the restaurant. Luckily, the place was only about 15 minutes away. I grabbed my keys and drove right back. When I arrived, the parking lot was almost completely empty, and most of the lights inside were dimmed. A young staff member recognized me immediately. "Mrs. Dunn?" "Yes, I left my purse behind." He smiled. "We found it. We kept it safe back in the private dining room." I thanked him and walked down the hallway. The room where the party had been held was mostly dark, with only a couple of lights still turned on. As I got closer to the doorway, I heard voices. Familiar voices. It was Lauren and Ethan. I stopped in my tracks, not because I intended to eavesdrop, but because I recognized my daughter's voice instantly. The door was cracked open and they couldn't see me. At first, I was about to just walk in. Then I heard Lauren say something that froze me completely solid. I seriously thought she was finally going to tell me about the cabin tonight. My heart skipped a beat. The cabin? The key? I stood entirely still, barely breathing. Ethan let out a long sigh. "Lauren, come on. Did you seriously expect your mom to announce your inheritance at her own retirement party?" Lauren let out a short, annoyed laugh. "Not announce it, but seriously, Ethan, she knows everything is going to be mine eventually anyway. Everything." That word hit me like a physical weight. I stood outside the room, completely motionless. Ethan sounded visibly uncomfortable. "You shouldn't talk about it like that." "I'm just being realistic." "No," his voice sharpened. "You're being entitled." Silence followed. For a split second, I felt a wave of relief that someone in that room understood how inappropriate the conversation was. Then Lauren spoke up again. "You don't understand." "Then explain it to me." Another pause followed. "I've spent years helping her out." I almost laughed out loud at that. Helping me out? What exactly had she helped with? The birthdays she forgot? The rushed visits when I had surgery? The quick phone calls she cut short? But I stayed quiet and kept listening. "She's getting older," Lauren continued. "At some point she's going to need someone to step in and manage everything for her." Ethan sighed again. "That wasn't what tonight was about." "Maybe not." "Then why are you so upset?" The answer came without a second of hesitation. "Because I thought she was finally starting to be practical." Practical. I felt a wave of physical nausea. My retirement celebration, the memory box, the letters, the photos, and my entire heart poured out. And all Lauren cared about was what was practical. The money, the property, and the assets. Not the memories, not the family, and not the love. I leaned back against the wall, suddenly feeling older than I ever had in my entire life. Ethan spoke softly. "You saw how much that gift meant to her." "No, I didn't, Lauren, I really didn't." You rolled your eyes. "I was just disappointed." The blunt honesty of her words stunned me. It wasn't because she admitted to it, but because she saw absolutely nothing wrong with it. She wasn't embarrassed, and she wasn't sorry. In her mind, her disappointment completely justified her behavior. Then came the sentence that changed everything. The words I would replay in my mind for weeks. The words that shattered every single excuse I had ever invented for her. Lauren said, honestly, she should just start transferring things over to my name now anyway, instead of making us wait. Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. It felt like all the air had been sucked right out of the hallway. Ethan didn't answer right away. When he finally found his voice, he sounded completely shocked. "Lauren, she's your mother." "I know that. Why are you acting like I'm talking about stealing from her?" she complained. "Oh, please." "Then what exactly are you talking about?" "I'm talking about planning." "Planning." The word sounded cold, calculating, and completely absurd. Then she lowered her voice, but not enough. "I mean, at the end of the day, the house, the investments, the cabin, it's all coming to us anyway. Us. Not her mother, not family memories, not an emotional connection, assets, numbers, properties, and things. For the first time that night, I stopped making excuses. I stopped blaming the stress, I stopped blaming her job, and I stopped blaming a simple misunderstanding. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding at all. Lauren understood everything perfectly. She just valued entirely different things than I did. That realization hurt far more than the rolled eyes. It hurt deeply. I quietly stepped backward, taking extra care not to make a single sound. I didn't care about my purse anymore. I didn't care about anything left in that room. The conversation had already given me something much more important. The truth. The painful, undeniable truth. A moment later, I walked back out to the front desk. The employee handed me my purse, and I thanked him. I walked outside, got into my car, and just sat there alone. The parking lot was nearly empty, and the city lights reflected off my windshield. For several minutes, I just stared straight ahead. I didn't cry, at least not yet. I just thought, 42 years. 42 years of sacrifice, 42 years of putting my daughter first, and somewhere along the line she had completely stopped viewing me as a human being. Maybe she still loved me in her own way. Honestly, I didn't know anymore, but she was definitely looking at my future through the lens of her inheritance. That much was blindingly clear. When the tears finally came, they were quiet, falling one by one. There was no drama, no loud sobbing, just pure heartbreak. Because the biggest sorrow wasn't about losing money or property or even respect. It was the crushing realization that the person you love unconditionally measures your worth in a completely different way than you ever imagined. Eventually, I started the car. On the drive home, one thought kept circling through my mind. I didn't want to get angry yet. It wasn't time for that. I was wide awake now. For the first time in decades, I knew I needed answers. More importantly, I needed to protect myself. The next morning, I was going to make a phone call. It was a call to someone I hadn't needed to speak with professionally in a very long time, my attorney, Daniel Harper. And that conversation would start to change everything. At exactly 9 o'clock the next morning, I called Daniel Harper. It wasn't out of desperation or anger, but simply because I couldn't stop thinking. I had barely slept at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Lauren's voice repeating, "It's all coming to us anyway." By sunrise, I knew I needed clarity, not revenge. I needed to see the full picture. Daniel Harper had been my attorney for nearly 20 years. He was incredibly competent, highly discreet, and organized, the kind of man who never rushed into a decision. When his receptionist answered, I asked if he had any time for a meeting. Fortunately, he did. 2 hours later, I was sitting in his office downtown. Daniel looked exactly the same as always, graying hair, gold-rimmed glasses, and a perfectly tidy desk. The only real difference was that we both looked a bit older. That's just how life goes. "Monica," he said warmly, "it's been a while." "Yes, it has," I smiled. "How is retirement treating you?" I let out a bitter laugh. "Not great, honestly." His expression shifted instantly. "What's going on?" For a second, I wanted to tell him everything. Then I hesitated, because saying things out loud makes them real, and I wasn't entirely sure I was ready to face it. Unfortunately, reality didn't care if I was ready or not. So, I told him everything. The memory box, the rolled eyes, the conversation outside the restaurant, the cabin, and the comments about the inheritance. All of it. Daniel listened quietly without interrupting. When I finished, he sat in silence for a few seconds, not out of shock, but because he was analyzing the situation. Finally, he folded his hands on his desk. "What do you want to do?" The question caught me off guard. "I don't know." He nodded. "That's completely fair. I don't want to overreact." "Then don't react at all yet." I appreciated that answer. Most people would immediately take a side, but Daniel never did. He preferred facts. Facts were safer, cleaner, and they caused less damage than emotions, at least most of the time. I took a deep breath. I think I need to review everything, all of it. My estate plan. Daniel leaned back in his chair. That's easy enough. He opened a filing cabinet, pulled out a thick folder, and placed it on the desk. It felt strange to see my entire life's work condensed into a single folder. Decades of effort reduced to paperwork. The house, the investment accounts, the retirement funds, the insurance policies, the lakeside cabin, everything. Daniel opened the folder. It's been years since we made any major changes. I nodded because that was true. For most of my adult life, my estate plan had been incredibly straightforward. If anything happened to me, everything went to Lauren. Not almost everything, everything. The house, the cabin, the accounts, the investments, all of it. At the time, it seemed like the natural thing to do. Lauren was my only child. Who else would it go to? Daniel reviewed the documents one by one while I stared at the paperwork. Every single signature represented trust, a deep belief that my daughter would eventually respect the sacrifices that created these assets, a belief that family meant something beyond money. Now that trust felt incredibly fragile. Daniel finally looked up. Your current plan leaves roughly 95% of your estate to Lauren. I nodded. The number didn't surprise me. What surprised me was how deeply uncomfortable it suddenly made me feel. Do you want to change it? I hesitated. No. Then I paused. Maybe. I haven't figured out what I actually want yet. That's perfectly okay. The kindness in his voice almost made me cry. For the first time since the party ended, someone wasn't demanding an immediate decision from me. He was giving me permission to think. Then something unexpected happened. Daniel reached for another folder, a much thinner one. There's one more thing you should know? My stomach tightened up. What's that? He adjusted his glasses. About 6 months ago, Lauren contacted my office. The room suddenly felt much smaller. She contacted you? Yes. I stared at him. Why? Daniel chose his words carefully. She stated that she wanted to help you get your affairs in order. Get your affairs in order. The phrase sounded familiar. Way too familiar. I recalled hearing similar comments from Lauren over the past several months. Casual remarks and questions that I had barely paid attention to at the time. What exactly did she ask? Daniel opened the thin folder. General questions, like whether your estate documents were up to date. I didn't say a word. Whether you had updated your beneficiary designations. Still silence. And if the ownership of the cabin had been transferred yet. That last one hit me hard, right in the chest. The cabin again. It was always about the cabin. Daniel continued. I obviously didn't provide her with any specific details. Of course, you couldn't without my authorization. I appreciated his professionalism. Still, the damage was already done. The questions themselves revealed a painful truth. Lauren hadn't suddenly developed an interest in my finances after my retirement party. She had been monitoring the situation for months, maybe even longer. That realization felt incredibly heavy. Daniel closed the folder. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now, he sighed, now I think the context matters. I nodded slowly. Because context changed everything. A concerned daughter asking about her mother's affairs was one thing. A daughter discussing future assets while expressing disappointment over an inheritance expectation was something else entirely. The difference between the two was massive. I stood up and walked over to the office window. Outside, people were moving through downtown Columbus, dealing with normal lives and normal problems. Meanwhile, my world felt more complicated by the minute. After a long silence, I turned back to face Daniel. Am I being unfair to her? The question surprised even me, but I needed an honest answer. Daniel considered it carefully. No. You don't think so? No. Why? His answer was simple. Because you are asking questions before making a decision. Those words stuck with me. Ask questions before deciding, and look at the facts before reacting. Maybe that was exactly what I needed. Not revenge and not punishment. Just understanding, protection, and boundaries. The very things I had ignored for decades. I sat back down and Daniel studied my face. Monica, can I offer a piece of advice? Please. For 42 years, you've been taking care of everyone else. I gave a bitter smile. That's what nurses do. Yes, he paused, but you're retired now. I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in a long time. You need to ask yourself a different question. What question? His voice grew softer. What do you want? Not what Lauren wanted, not what Ethan wanted, and not what society expected, but what I wanted. The truth was, I had no idea. I had spent so many years putting everyone else first that the question felt completely foreign, uncomfortable, and almost selfish. Yet, sitting there, another realization began to surface. I wasn't upset simply because Lauren wanted money. The money wasn't the real issue. I was heartbroken because she seemed to value the money far more than she valued me. That was the wound. That was the betrayal. Daniel finally closed the folder. We don't need to change a single thing today. A massive wave of relief washed over me. Thank you. But I do think you should take some time to evaluate your options. I nodded. I will. And Monica? Yes? Before you protect your assets, make sure you protect yourself emotionally. I just looked at him. That was probably the wisest advice anyone had given me all year. Because the simple truth was, my heart had become vulnerable long before my property ever did. When I left Daniel's office that afternoon, I wasn't carrying new paperwork, a revised will, or a plan for revenge. I left with something much more important: clarity. For the first time, I could see the entire situation clearly. And once you truly see something, it's impossible to pretend you don't. What I didn't realize at the time was that very soon, someone else was going to show me a completely different kind of relationship. One built on gratitude instead of expectations, and kindness instead of entitlement. Her name was Grace Walker. After my meeting with Daniel, I spent several days just trying to clear my head. I went for longer walks, read more books, and spent much less time staring at my phone waiting for a call from Lauren. It wasn't easy. For decades, my schedule had revolved completely around other people: patients, doctors, coworkers, and family. Now, retirement gave me something unfamiliar: time. And when your heart is broken, time can be a dangerous thing. It gives your mind too much space to wander. And my mind kept wandering right back to the restaurant and right back to Lauren. It went back to the painful realization that I had spent years ignoring the signs I simply didn't want to see. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, I was cleaning out a closet when I found an old hospital wristband. Seeing it instantly took me back 2 years, to one of the most difficult times in my life. A period I rarely thought about lately, but it was the exact time I met Grace Walker. I was 65 back then, still working full-time and convinced I was bulletproof. Then my body finally protested. A routine checkup revealed a medical condition that required immediate surgery. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was serious enough to require a hospital stay and several weeks of recovery. For someone who had spent 40 years taking care of patients, becoming the patient felt incredibly strange. I hated it. I hated losing my independence. I hated asking for help. And I hated lying in a bed letting other people take care of me. The first night after the surgery was especially rough. The pain medication made me groggy, the room felt freezing cold, and the machines kept constantly beeping. Despite being surrounded by medical professionals, I felt deeply alone. Lauren had stopped by briefly that afternoon, maybe for 20 minutes, 30 at the most. She brought some flowers, kept constantly checking her phone, told me she had meetings to get back to, and then she left. At the time, I didn't blame her. She had a career, a family, and responsibilities. At least that's what I told myself. The next day, she didn't come at all. The third day, she stayed for 15 minutes. On the fourth day, she sent a quick text message but didn't visit. Once again, I made excuses. Once again, I chose to be understanding. But the truth was, I noticed. Of course I noticed. People always notice who shows up when they are at their most vulnerable. Around 9 o'clock one evening, a young nurse walked into my room carrying a cup of hot tea. I remember her clearly. Deep brown hair tied back in a ponytail, tired eyes, and a genuinely kind smile. She couldn't have been more than 29 years old. "Can't sleep?" she asked. I gave a weak smile. "Is it that obvious?" "A little bit," she said, handing me the mug. "It's chamomile." "Thank you." Most nurses would have left right after that, not because they didn't care, but because they were incredibly busy. Hospitals never stop moving. But she stayed, even if it was just for a few minutes. It was just enough time to ask how I was really doing, enough time to listen, and enough time to make me feel like a human being instead of just another patient chart. That was Grace Walker. At the time, I figured she was just excellent at her job. Later, I realized that kindness was simply a fundamental part of who she was. Over the next few days, Grace became one of my primary nurses. On every single shift she worked, she checked in on me just a little bit more than necessary. It was never intrusive, it was just human. She remembered the small details, asking about my grandson, my retirement plans, and my late husband. When I answered, she listened intently. She truly listened. One evening, she noticed me staring at a family photograph. "Your daughter?" she asked. I smiled. "Yes, she's beautiful." "She really is," Grace nodded. "You look very proud." "I am." The answer came out automatically because despite everything, I was proud of Lauren. I always would be. Grace sat down briefly by the edge of the bed. "My mom passed away when I was 12. The admission caught me by surprise and I looked at her. She gave a slight shrug. "Car accident." The coincidence hit me instantly, since Michael had lost his life the exact same way. We talked for several minutes, not as a nurse and a patient, but as two women who understood the deep ache of loss. By the time the conversation ended, I felt a genuine connection to her, as if we had skipped the small talk and landed directly on something real. Throughout my recovery, those conversations continued. There was nothing earth-shattering or life-altering about them, just pure honesty. Grace told me about nursing school, her student loans, working overtime, and trying to build a future. I told her about Lauren, about raising a child alone, and about the sacrifices that come with motherhood. Sometimes we laughed, sometimes we shared stories, and sometimes we just sat in comfortable silence. Somehow, during one of the toughest seasons of my life, Grace made that hospital room feel a lot less lonely. I didn't fully realize the contrast between Grace and Lauren back then. I wasn't comparing them, keeping score, or looking for evidence. I was simply grateful. After I was discharged, Grace and I stayed in touch occasionally. Nothing extravagant. The occasional holiday card, a text message, updates on life. It was the kind of relationship that develops naturally when people genuinely care about one another. Then, something unexpected happened. About a year later, Grace asked me to grab coffee. She looked incredibly nervous the entire time, and eventually she admitted why. She was struggling financially, not because she was irresponsible, but because life had just gotten too expensive. Her father had fallen ill, medical bills were piling up, her student debt was heavy, and she was seriously considering dropping out of an advanced nursing certification program she desperately wanted to finish. The sadness in her voice reminded me exactly of someone else, a younger version of myself. The woman who used to work endless overtime just to create opportunities for Lauren. After our coffee, I went home and thought about our conversation for days. Then I made a decision, a personal decision that I didn't share with anyone, not even Grace. I contacted the certification program and anonymously paid off her remaining tuition in full, every single penny. I never expected Grace to find out the truth, and I certainly wasn't looking for anything in return. Helping people was what I had done my entire career. It felt natural, simple, and right. 3 months later, Grace somehow discovered the truth. To this day, I still don't know how she tracked it down, but she called me in tears. She was sobbing. "Why would you do that?" she asked. I smiled, because someone helped me once too. "No," her voice caught. "You didn't have to do that." She repeated that phrase several times. "You didn't have to do that." Those words stayed with me, because gratitude sounds completely different than entitlement. Very different. Lauren often spoke as if supporting her was simply an obligation, while Grace spoke as if a simple act of kindness was an absolute miracle. That distinction was far more important than I realized at the time. 2 years later, standing in my closet with that hospital wristband in my hand, I suddenly understood why that memory felt so powerful. It actually had nothing to do with the surgery, the recovery, or even the friendship itself. It was about perspective. Grace had never asked me for a single thing, never expected anything, and never viewed me as an opportunity. She simply appreciated me for exactly who I was. After everything that happened with Lauren, that realization was impossible to ignore. For the first time in my life, I found myself lingering on a question I had never dared to ask before. What if family isn't defined solely by blood? What if the people who actually value your heart deserve more consideration than the ones who are simply eyeing your assets? The thought made me uncomfortable, but it also made me think deeply. The more I reflected on it, the harder it became to shake off. Because while Lauren seemed increasingly interested in my legacy, Grace had only ever been interested in me. Soon, another series of events made that difference completely impossible to ignore. After my meeting with Daniel and reflecting on Grace, I made a promise to myself. I would stop jumping to conclusions, I would stop assuming the worst, and most importantly, I would give Lauren every single opportunity to prove me wrong. A massive part of my heart desperately wanted to be wrong. What mother wants to believe her child views her as an inheritance instead of a person? I certainly didn't, not after loving that child for 42 years. So, I decided to observe rather than react. I wouldn't make accusations, I wouldn't confront her, and I wouldn't bring up the conversation outside the restaurant. I would simply pay attention. Sometimes, when you stop hiding from it, the truth surfaces all on its own. The very first sign appeared less than a week later. Lauren called me on a Tuesday afternoon. That wasn't unusual, but the length of the call certainly was. Typically, our conversations lasted maybe 5 to 10 minutes, but this one went on for nearly 40. At first, I felt incredibly hopeful. Maybe she missed me, maybe she wanted to reconnect, and maybe I had misjudged the entire situation. We talked about Noah's baseball season, the weather, retirement, and my garden, completely ordinary things. Then, the topic shifted subtly, almost seamlessly. "So," Lauren said casually, "have you thought about what you're doing with all your retirement accounts yet?" I froze. The question sounded innocent enough, but after everything that had happened, I noticed it instantly. "I hasn't thought much about it." "You really should get everything organized." "I will." Another pause followed. "What about the cabin?" There it was, the cabin again. I forced myself to sound completely relaxed. "What about it?" "Oh, nothing." Her voice remained light. Too light. "I was just curious." Curious. I remembered Daniel's folder, the questions from months ago, and the digging. Curious seemed to have become Lauren's favorite word. We ended the call shortly after that, and as I put my phone down, a strange feeling washed over me. It wasn't anger, it was confirmation. A tiny piece of a puzzle falling into place. A single short conversation didn't mean much on its own, but a pattern spoke volumes. And a pattern was definitely starting to emerge. Over the next 2 weeks, her calls became more frequent than ever before, every few days, sometimes even daily. On the surface, it looked like genuine care, a daughter checking in on her retired mother. Any outsider looking in probably would have found it incredibly touching. I almost did too, until I started focusing on what she was actually asking. First came questions about my health, followed quickly by insurance, my house, my investments, legal documents, taxes, and the cabin. Always the cabin. The topics kept circling right back to that exact spot, like a compass finding north. One afternoon, she called while I was out grocery shopping. "Mom, have you ever thought about adding someone else's name to your accounts just for convenience?" The question made me stop dead in the middle of the supermarket aisle. "For convenience?" "Yeah," she laughed. "You know, just in case anything ever happens. In case anything ever happens." Another innocent-sounding phrase with a hidden motive. I stared at the shelves full of cereal boxes, considering my response. "I hasn't really thought about it." "You should look into it." "Why?" "Because it just makes things a lot easier." "Easier for whom?" I didn't ask the question out loud. I already knew the answer. That evening, I mentioned the conversation to Patricia while we were having dinner at my house. She listened quietly, then set her fork down. "Monica?" "Yes?" "You see it clearly now, don't you?" I sighed. "Maybe." "No," her voice was gentle. "You see it." Patricia had never disliked Lauren. In fact, she had always been incredibly supportive of her, which made her opinion much harder to ignore. "I just don't want to believe it." "I know." The sadness in her voice was heartbreaking, because she wasn't trying to convince me of anything. She was simply watching me slowly accept the facts she had noticed a long time ago. A few days later, another incident occurred, making denial almost entirely impossible. Lauren dropped by unannounced on a Saturday morning. This was highly unusual. Before my retirement, she rarely had any free time. Now she suddenly seemed completely available. She brought over coffee and pastries, acting friendly, warm, and attentive. It was a version of Lauren I hadn't seen in years. For a brief second, I almost felt guilty for doubting her. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe I had let one painful conversation twist everything out of proportion. Then we sat down in the living room, and within 20 minutes, she brought up the paperwork again. "I can help you organize your files if you want." I smiled. "That's very sweet of you, and it makes sense, but I can handle it on my own for now." "Of course," she smiled back, "but it's a lot of paperwork." Then her eyes drifted over toward my desk and the filing cabinet sitting right next to it. the cabinet containing my financial records, legal documents, and property information. The glance lasted only a second, but I caught it because I was paying attention now, very close attention. Later that afternoon, after Lauren left, I opened the filing cabinet. Everything inside looked completely untouched. Still, I felt a strange sense of protectiveness wash over me. It wasn't about the paperwork itself, but rather what it represented: independence, control, and choices. For decades, I had given away money, time, energy, and support without asking for anything in return. Now, for the first time in my life, I was starting to wonder if someone had mistaken my generosity for an absolute obligation. The following week brought another surprise, a text message that was entirely unmistakable. "Lauren, do you still have the original deed to the cabin?" I stared at my phone, reading the message twice, then a third time. It wasn't because it was complicated, but because it was impossible to misinterpret. I typed back slowly, "Why do you ask?" Her reply came instantly, "Just curious." Curious. The exact same word, the exact same pattern, and the exact same focus. In that precise moment, something shifted deep inside me. It wasn't dramatic or angry, it was entirely quiet, like ice beginning to melt long before anyone notices. I realized I didn't need to wait for evidence anymore. The evidence was piling up all on its own. One question after another, one conversation after another, always leading back to the assets, the ownership, and the things that would eventually belong to her, or that she believed should belong to her. That night, I created a folder on my laptop. It was nothing complicated, just a simple folder where I saved screenshots of the text messages, dates, conversations, and notes. I didn't do it because I planned to use them against her. I did it because I wanted a record, something objective and factual. Daniel's voice echoed in my mind. Ask questions before deciding, and look at the facts before drawing a conclusion. So, I gathered the facts, more for my own peace of mind than anything else. A few days later, I received another call. This time, Lauren sounded unusually enthusiastic. "Mom, I have an idea." I immediately felt a wave of unease. "What idea?" "We should get together and go through all of your files together." There it was, direct and upfront, no longer hidden behind casual questions. "There's no rush," she added quickly, "but it would just be the smart thing to do." Smart, practical, convenient, efficient. The vocabulary kept changing, but the destination remained exactly the same. For the first time in my life, I decided to stop playing along, at least not entirely. "I appreciate the offer." A brief silence followed. Then she asked, "But..." I gave a bitter smile. "But I think I'm doing just fine on my own." The silence grew longer, noticeably longer. When she finally spoke again, her voice sounded completely different. It wasn't angry, it was disappointed. It was the exact same tone of disappointment I had heard when she opened the memory box. That realization sent a chill down my spine, because it hinted at a painful truth. Maybe that moment with the memory box wasn't an isolated incident at all. Maybe it was just the very first crack appearing in a mask she was finding harder and harder to maintain. After the call ended, I found myself staring out the living room window. The sun was going down, and the sky was glowing with shades of orange and gold, beautiful and peaceful. Yet, I couldn't shake a growing sense of worry. Lauren's questions were becoming more frequent, more direct, and more focused. Deep down, I had an uneasy feeling that she wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Something bigger was coming, something that would reveal exactly how far she was willing to go to get what she wanted. The invitation arrived on a Thursday afternoon as a simple text from Lauren. "Mom, let's grab dinner on Saturday. Just us and Ethan. We really want to spend some quality time with you." I stared at the screen longer than usual. In any other circumstance, that message would have made me incredibly happy. A family dinner, spending time together, connecting. Those were the exact things I hoped retirement would bring. But things weren't normal anymore. The reality was what it was, and that reality made me cautious. Despite my doubts, I accepted the invitation. It wasn't because I trusted the situation, but because I wanted to see it through. Saturday evening arrived with clear skies and warm weather. Lauren and Ethan lived in a beautiful neighborhood just outside Cincinnati, the kind of place with perfectly manicured lawns and expensive SUVs parked in every driveway. When I arrived, Ethan greeted me warmly, just like he always did. "Great to see you, Monica." "You too, Ethan." He hugged me. It was a genuine hug too, not rushed and not distracted. That was one of the main reasons I appreciated Ethan so much. He never made me feel like I was a burden to have around. Lauren appeared a moment later, smiling and acting friendly. Honestly, a bit too friendly. It felt unnatural. She kissed my cheek, asked how I had been, and handed me a drink. The entire evening felt intensely stage-managed, like everyone was reading from a script, especially Lauren. Dinner started out pleasant enough. We talked about Noah's upcoming school year, vacation plans, local news, and the weather. Safe topics, comfortable topics. Lauren laughed more than usual, complimented my outfit, and asked a few questions about retirement. Anyone looking in from the outside would have seen a loving family sharing a nice meal, but underneath the surface I could feel the tension. It wasn't something you could see, but rather an anticipation, like everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. About 45 minutes into dinner, I found out exactly what that shoe was. Lauren stood up and disappeared into another room. When she came back, she was holding a large manila folder. My stomach instantly knotted up. This was it. The moment I had been anticipating, the thing I had been dreading. She sat back down, placed the folder on the table, and gave a tight smile. "I wanted to talk to you about something." Of course she did. I glanced over at Ethan. His expression shifted instantly, subtle but telling. It looked as though he knew exactly what was coming and wasn't entirely comfortable with it. Lauren opened the folder. Inside were documents, several pages, perfectly organized and clearly prepared well in advance. That detail was important because it meant this wasn't a casual thought. This was a plan, a highly calculated one. "Mom," she began, "I've been thinking a lot about the future lately." The future. It was always about the future. I stayed quiet, letting her continue. "I know you're healthy, thank goodness. I mean that," she said, offering a smile. "Huanjing, but it's just important to be prepared for things." There was that word again. Prepared, planning, organized, practical. The vocabulary never really changed, only the packaging did. Lauren pushed a few pages across the table toward me. "I spoke with someone who specializes in estate organization." Estate organization? Interesting. Very interesting. I looked down at the paperwork. The documents looked professional, legal, and highly complex. The kind of paperwork most people wouldn't fully understand at first glance. Fortunately, I wasn't most people. For the past few weeks, I had been speaking with Daniel Harper, and Daniel had taught me one very important rule. Read everything. Every single word, every page, and every clause. No exceptions. So, I did. As I slowly read through the first document, then the second, and then the third, the room fell dead silent. The further I read, the colder I felt. Because this wasn't estate organization at all. It wasn't. It was a transfer of ownership. An immediate transfer of ownership, not after my lifetime, but right now. The language on the pages was incredibly clear. Property interest, shared ownership structures, asset management authority, and beneficiary modifications. It wasn't outright theft. There was nothing illegal about it. It wasn't that obvious. But it was absolutely designed to strip the control right out of my hands and give it directly to Lauren. I kept reading. Lauren watched me closely, too closely, like a student waiting for a test score. Finally, I looked up. "What exactly is this?" Her smile flickered just for a split second. "It's just some paperwork." I almost laughed out loud. Just some paperwork. The phrasing was absurd. "Paperwork for what?" She leaned forward. "To just make things easier down the road. Easier down the road." I set the papers down. For several seconds, nobody said a word. Then Ethan cleared his throat. The sound caught me off guard because he sounded incredibly uncomfortable. Deeply uncomfortable. Lauren shot him a look, a warning glance. It was quick, but I caught it, and clearly Ethan did too. He looked away. "Interesting, very interesting." I turned back to Lauren. "Why now?" The question seemed simple enough, but she struggled to answer it. "Because it's just the smart thing to do." That's not an answer. Another pause followed. Then she tried again. "Because eventually we're going to have to handle these things anyway. Eventually." There it was. The word that revealed everything. Eventually. The future she kept talking about. The future where my assets became hers. The future she seemed increasingly desperate to organize. I calmly folded my hands. Years of nursing had taught me a valuable lesson. When you stay calm, people reveal much more. Anger shuts a conversation down, but silence opens it up. So, I stayed calm. Very calm. "Lauren." "Yeah? Did Daniel Harper tell you to do this?" The question landed with far more weight than I expected. She froze. It wasn't dramatic, but it was obvious. That hesitation told me more than any verbal answer ever could. No. Interesting, because Daniel absolutely hadn't told her to do this. I already knew that for a fact. Then another realization hit me. She had no idea I had been to see Daniel yet. At least not yet. Suddenly I understood why she looked so nervous. She was assuming I was uninformed, unprepared, and easily persuaded. The realization hurt far more than I cared to admit. It showed that she viewed me as weak, not as her mother, but as an obstacle to be managed. I glanced at the documents one last time, then closed the folder. "I'm not signing anything." The words were spoken quietly and firmly, leaving no room for argument. Lauren blinked. "What?" "I'm not signing anything." The room went dead silent. Ethan stared down at the table, while Lauren glared directly at me. The friendly atmosphere vanished instantly, gone as if it had never existed in the first place. For the first time all evening, I saw the raw frustration behind her smile. "Mom, you haven't even considered it." "I have considered it." "You only read it for 5 minutes. I read enough." She clamped her jaw shut. "You're being stubborn." The accusation surprised me, not because it was harsh, but because of how quickly it came out. It was almost as if she had anticipated my resistance and had come prepared for it. I felt something shift deep inside me. Another piece of denial fell away. The old Monica would have apologized, explained herself, and tried to keep the peace. But retirement changes things, or rather the truth does. "I'm being cautious, there's a difference." Lauren leaned back in her chair, now visibly irritated. "This would just make everything so much easier." I nodded slowly. "Easier for whom?" The question hung heavily in the air, uncomfortable and dangerous. Lauren didn't answer right away because she couldn't, at least not honestly. For the first time in several minutes, Ethan finally spoke up. "Maybe we should just drop it for tonight." I gave him a grateful look, but Lauren didn't. Her expression darkened. "Why?" "Because your mom said no." It was simple, reasonable, and obvious. Yet Lauren seemed genuinely frustrated by the concept. That reaction deeply disturbed me, because no should have been more than enough, especially when the person saying it owned every single asset involved. Eventually, the conversation shifted, sort of. Dinner continued, but the warmth never returned. Something had been exposed, something that could never be hidden again. When I finally left that night, Lauren gave me a goodbye hug. The embrace felt completely different. Forced, disappointed, and bordering on resentful. On the drive home, I replayed everything that had happened, the prepared folder, the documents, the pressure, and her intense frustration when I refused. For the first time in my life, an unsettling possibility crossed my mind. Maybe Lauren wasn't just interested in my future assets, maybe she was getting impatient. If that was true, then the situation was far more serious than I had initially thought. For 3 days after that dinner, Lauren didn't call. That silence alone spoke volumes. For weeks, she had been contacting me constantly, checking in, asking questions, offering help, and putting on a show of care. The exact moment I refused to sign those documents, all communication stopped. It wasn't a total cutoff, but it was a noticeable drop. The silence didn't prove anything by itself. Still, it added another piece to the growing puzzle, and I could no longer pretend I didn't see the picture it was forming. On the 4th day, I walked into the guest bedroom and looked at the memory box, the box that had started it all, the one Lauren had dismissed as a box of junk. It sat quietly on the bookshelf where I had placed it after the retirement party, untouched and seemingly forgotten. Yet somehow it felt more important now than ever before. I carried it into the living room and set it on the coffee table. Then I slowly opened the lid. The familiar scent of old paper washed over me. Photos, letters, keepsakes, pieces of a lifetime. I picked up one of the photographs. It was Lauren at 7 years old, missing her front teeth, holding my hand on her first day of school. I couldn't help but smile. She had been so excited back then, so trusting, and so full of love. Then I opened one of the letters. One I had written specifically for her retirement gift. A letter she had never bothered to read. My eyes scanned the pages. I had written about working double shifts just to pay for her dance lessons, about driving through snowstorms to make it to her school plays, about the sleepless nights spent worrying over bills, and about how incredibly proud I was of every success she achieved. Every single word had come straight from my heart, and she hadn't even finished reading it. The realization stung all over again. It wasn't because she rejected a physical gift, but because she rejected the meaning behind it. I sat in silence for nearly an hour, thinking, remembering, and grieving. Eventually, I came to a conclusion. The memory box had failed, at least in the way I had intended. It hadn't built a connection, it hadn't created understanding, and it hadn't reminded Lauren of what truly mattered. Maybe that was because she had never actually looked inside. Suddenly, I knew exactly what I needed to do. The next morning, I wrote a letter. It wasn't long, just a single page, simple, honest, and direct. There was no anger, no accusations, and no insults, just the facts. When I finished, I placed the letter inside the memory box. Then, I closed the lid. An hour later, I drove to a shipping center and sent it out. The recipient was Lauren. There was no explanation, no warning, nothing. Just the box and the letter. The package arrived the following afternoon. I knew this because less than an hour later, my phone rang with Lauren's name on the screen. The moment I saw it, I knew she had opened it. I answered calmly. "Hello, Mom?" Her voice sounded incredibly tight, very tense. "Did you ship the memory box back to me?" "Yes, I did." Silence, a long, heavy silence. Why would you do that?" I looked out the kitchen window. The autumn leaves were starting to turn shades of orange, gold, and red, beautiful and fleeting. The answer felt remarkably similar. "Because it belongs to you." Another pause. Then Lauren asked, "What is this letter supposed to mean?" I already knew exactly which part was bothering her. The entire letter was only a few paragraphs long, but one sentence stood out above all the rest. "You taught me exactly what my love is worth to you." That line had clearly hit its mark. "Which part is confusing to you?" I asked gently. Her frustration immediately surfaced. "Mom," I waited. "You know exactly what I mean." "Yes, I did, but I wanted her to say it herself." "I don't understand why you're acting like this." The irony almost made me smile. Acting like this. As if the issue had appeared out of thin air, as if it hadn't been building for months, if not years. I took a slow, deep breath. "Lauren, what did you actually read? The letters?" A pause, a very telling pause, then, Some of them. Not all of them, of course." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Did you read the one about your college graduation?" "No." "The one about your father?" "No." "The one about Noah?" "No." Silence. The answer explained everything. She still had zero interest in the memories. She was interested in the conflict, not the meaning. Eventually, she spoke up again. "You hurt my feelings." The statement caught me off guard, not because it was impossible, but because it felt completely backwards. I wanted to ask if she had any idea what she had done to my feelings. Instead, I chose absolute honesty. "You hurt mine first." The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument ever could, because it contained a truth neither of us could escape. When Lauren finally spoke, her voice softened just a fraction. "I didn't mean to." To some extent, I believed her. Cruelty isn't always intentional. Sometimes it's just selfishness. Sometimes it's entitlement, and sometimes it's just carelessness. But the result is exactly the same level of pain. "I know." Another pause. Then she asked a question that shifted the entire nature of the conversation. "Is this about those documents?" There it was. Not the letters, not the photos, and not the retirement party. The documents, the assets, the ownership, the things she actually cared about. My heart sank all over again because even now she still didn't understand. "No." "Then what is it about?" I looked across the room at the empty chair where Michael used to sit, the chair that had been empty for decades. Suddenly, the answer became crystal clear. "It's about value." "What does that mean?" "It means I spent weeks pouring my heart into creating something for you." Silence. "And you looked at it for less than a minute." I could hear her breathing on the other end, but nothing else. I continued, "All you saw was junk." Another silence followed, this one even longer, painful and entirely necessary. Finally, Lauren let out a sigh. "I think you're completely overreacting." Those words hit harder than I expected. It wasn't because they were cruel, but because they revealed just how little she understood, or perhaps how little she wanted to understand. The conversation ended shortly after that. There was no shouting, no insults, just a profound distance. It was the kind of emotional distance that happens when two people are standing in completely different realities. After hanging up, I sat quietly for a few minutes. Then my phone rang again. This time it was Ethan. "Interesting, very interesting," I answered the call. "Hello." "Monica." His voice sounded hesitant, almost nervous. "Hi, Ethan." "I hope I'm not bothering you." "Not at all." A brief pause followed, and then he caught me completely by surprise. "I read the letters." I closed my eyes, unable to speak for a moment. Those 4 words meant far more than he could ever realize. Someone had actually looked inside. Someone had taken the time. I see. They're beautiful, Monica. Emotion swelled in my chest. Thank you, Ethan. Another pause. Then Ethan said something I will never forget. Lauren doesn't understand what those letters actually cost you. The cost. Not the money, not the property, and not the assets. The emotion, the sacrifice, and the love. Finally, someone understood. For the first time since my retirement party, I felt truly seen. Deeply seen. But the call also confirmed an unsettling truth. If Ethan could understand the value of the memory box, why couldn't Lauren? The answer was chilling. I was starting to realize this wasn't a simple misunderstanding at all. It was a deliberate choice. And if that was true, then the decisions I needed to make moving forward were becoming clearer by the day. 3 days after my phone call with Ethan, I found myself sitting right back in Daniel Harper's office. This time, I wasn't looking for answers. I was there to make firm decisions. The distinction was crucial. The first meeting had been about figuring out what was happening, but this second one was about deciding exactly what I wanted to do about it. Daniel greeted me with his usual calm professionalism, but the moment he saw the look on my face, he knew things had changed. You've made up your mind. It wasn't a question. I nodded. For the most part, yes. He motioned for me to take a seat across from his desk. Tell me. I sat down, staring at the folder in my lap for a few seconds. Inside were notes, financial statements, property records, and most importantly, clarity. Weeks ago, I had been driven by raw emotion. Now, I was driven entirely by reality. The difference was massive. I don't want to punish Lauren. Daniel nodded. Good. I mean that sincerely. I know you do. I took a deep breath. But I also don't want to reward behavior that hurts people. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth. It wasn't because they weren't true, but because I had spent most of my life doing the exact opposite. Making excuses, forgiving too quickly, giving without limits, and protecting people from the consequences of their actions. Especially Lauren. Daniel remained quiet, allowing me to keep going. I kept asking myself the same question. What's that? If I weren't her mother, would I ever allow someone to treat me this way? The answer came to me instantly. No, absolutely not. I would never tolerate that kind of behavior from a friend, a coworker, a neighbor, or anyone else. Yet being a mother had convinced me to accept things I would have rejected anywhere else. The realization was painful, but completely necessary. Daniel leaned forward slightly. What do you want your estate to reflect? The question caught me off guard. It wasn't about who gets what, but what the legacy actually reflects. That distinction was vital because he wasn't asking where the money should go. He was asking what core values should guide the decision. I thought about it carefully before answering. Gratitude. He nodded. What else? Empathy. He nodded again. Anything else? I gave a bitter smile. The people who genuinely care about others. The room fell quiet, a thoughtful, reflective kind of quiet. Then Daniel opened a legal pad. Let's start right there. Over the next 2 hours, we reviewed every single asset I owned. The house, the cabin, the investment accounts, the retirement funds, the savings, and the insurance policies. For years, almost every bit of it had been destined for Lauren. Now, I was completely restructuring that arrangement. It wasn't because I stopped loving my daughter. That would never happen. But because love and accountability are not opposites. At least, they shouldn't be. As we went through the numbers line by line, I found myself thinking back to Grace. Her gratitude, her kindness, and the way she had treated me when there was absolutely nothing in it for her. Then I thought about the nursing profession itself, the career that had defined my life. I thought about the young nurses struggling under heavy student debt, and the future caregivers who would one day look after people just like me. An idea slowly began to take shape, and by noon it had turned into a concrete plan. Daniel looked over his notes. You want to establish a scholarship fund? Yes, for nursing students. It felt entirely right, deeply right, from a place of absolute certainty. That money would create real opportunity, just like someone had once created opportunity for me. Daniel made some adjustments to his notes. What amount are you considering? I gave him a figure and his eyebrows raised slightly. It wasn't because the amount was unreasonable, but because it was highly significant. I nodded. I've thought it through completely. I can see that. Next came another decision, one that surprised even me. I want to include Grace as well. Daniel looked up from his pad. The nurse? Yes. He waited for me to explain, so I did. The surgery, the friendship, the certification program, her deep gratitude and her empathy. All of it. When I finished, Daniel smiled. She sounds like an incredible person. She really is. The response came automatically because it was a profound truth. We discussed several options and eventually settled on an amount that was meaningful but reasonable, enough to provide real help without causing any unnecessary complications. The decision felt balanced and entirely fair. Then came another thought, one that had been quietly lingering in the back of my mind. There was a local nonprofit organization that helped older adults who had been financially exploited by relatives. I had volunteered there occasionally over the years, and the stories were absolutely heartbreaking. Manipulated parents, grandparents forced into concessions, and widows persuaded to sign over assets, completely losing their independence because they trusted the wrong family members. The more I reflected on those situations, the firmer my resolve became. A portion of my estate would go to support that organization as well. Daniel wrote everything down methodically and carefully. Then we reached the hardest topic of all. Lauren, my daughter, the little girl I had spent decades loving, the woman who had broken my heart, and the child I still loved despite everything. And what about her? Daniel asked softly. The question hung heavily in the air, complex and painful. I looked down at my hands. For a split second I saw a younger version of myself, a tired widow working night shifts at the hospital, a mother who sacrificed everything for her child. Then I saw the present reality, the rolled eyes, the legal documents, the conversations, and the intense entitlement. Both realities existed at the same time, and I couldn't ignore either one. Finally, I spoke. I don't want to disinherit her. Daniel nodded slowly. I think he had anticipated that answer all along. Despite everything, I didn't want revenge, and I didn't want to be cruel. I wanted truth. And the truth was that Lauren was still my daughter. That would never change. But the consequences of the choices she had made wouldn't change either. I want her to receive something deeply meaningful. Daniel waited. Then my next words caught us both by surprise. The memory box. His expression softened. The original one? Yes, I gave a bitter smile, and the letters. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The exact item she had dismissed so easily, the object she deemed entirely worthless, and the one thing she barely glanced at. That would become the most personal part of her inheritance. It wasn't to punish her, but to give her one final opportunity to understand, one last chance to truly see me for who I was. Then I added a condition. Daniel found it a bit unusual but entirely feasible from a legal standpoint. A personal letter would be delivered alongside the memory box, a letter explaining every single decision, every reason, and every lesson learned. It wouldn't contain anger or a desire for retaliation, just complete honesty. It was the kind of letter a mother writes when she still holds on to hope that her child can learn something valuable. Daniel finished taking his notes and leaned back. How are you feeling? The question surprised me. I considered it honestly before answering, at peace. And I truly was. For the first time since my retirement party, I felt a deep sense of calm wash over me. It wasn't pure happiness or simple relief, but true peace. Because these decisions reflected my core values, not my anger or my disappointment. That distinction was everything. Before I left, Daniel reviewed the preliminary structure one last time. The nursing scholarships, Grace, the elder advocacy group, future educational support for Noah, and Lauren's modified inheritance. Everything was balanced, deeply considered, and meaningful. As I stood up to leave, Daniel offered one final observation. You know, Monica, most people change their wills because they are angry. I smiled. And what about me? I think you changed yours because you're finally being completely honest. Those words stayed with me the entire drive home because he was exactly right. This wasn't about punishment. It was about honesty. Being honest about who showed up for me when I needed it. Honest about what truly mattered. And honest about the kind of legacy I wanted to leave behind. Even though Lauren had no idea what decisions I had made yet, I knew one thing for certain. When she finally discovered the truth, everything would change. The confrontation happened much sooner than I anticipated. Less than 2 weeks after my meeting with Daniel, Lauren discovered that things had changed. To this day, I still don't know exactly how she found out. Perhaps she contacted another attorney, noticed some paperwork, or simply sensed that she was losing control over a situation she assumed she had entirely managed. Whatever the reason, she called me on a Tuesday morning. From the exact moment I answered, I knew this was not a normal call. "Mom!" Her voice was sharp, tight, and furious. I set my coffee cup down. "Good morning to you too, Lauren. Did you change your will?" There it was. No pleasantries, no greeting, straight to the point. I stared out the kitchen window for a few seconds, not because I didn't know the answer, but because the question itself struck me. Most people would ask how their mother was doing, but Lauren was asking about legal documents. "Why do you ask?" "Because I heard you went to see Daniel." "Interesting, very interesting." "I did." "Did you change it?" I could have lied, or I could have avoided the conversation entirely. But I was thoroughly exhausted from avoiding things, tired of pretending, and done with protecting everyone else's comfort at the expense of my own. "Yes, I did." The silence lasted only a fraction of a second before the storm hit. "What is wrong with you?" I actually pulled the phone away from my ear, not because she was yelling, but because I simply couldn't believe what I was hearing. "What? Why would you do that?" I took a slow, deep breath. "Lauren." "No," her voice grew louder. "I want an answer." The sheer entitlement of it stunned me. It wasn't because it was the first time it had happened, but because it had finally reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. She wasn't asking why I had made a specific choice. She was demanding that I justify my right to make that choice in the first place. There was a massive divide between the two. "Do you want to come over?" I asked calmly. "What?" "We should talk about this in person." The suggestion caught her off guard. I could hear it in her voice. Perhaps she expected me to be defensive, full of guilt, or making excuses. Instead, I offered a conversation, a real one. After a brief pause, she agreed. 3 hours later, Lauren's car pulled into my driveway. She came alone, no Ethan, just Lauren. The moment she stepped inside, I knew she was absolutely furious. It wasn't disappointment or hurt, it was pure rage. Her jaw was clamped shut, her body was rigid, and her eyes burned with frustration. Suddenly, I was reminded of the little girl who used to throw massive tantrums whenever she didn't get her way. The similarity was deeply unsettling. We sat face to face in the living room, neither of us speaking right away. Finally, Lauren broke the silence. "How much did you change?" I blinked. Not "hello," not "how have you been," or "can we talk," but "how much did you change?" I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was incredibly telling, incredibly revealing. I don't think that's the right place to start. Then where should we start? I leaned back in my chair. "Why are you so angry?" The question seemed entirely reasonable. Her response was immediate. "Because this isn't fair." Fair. There was that word again. I had heard it many times throughout my life, typically from people who wanted to take something. "What isn't fair?" "You changed everything." I nodded slowly. "What exactly belongs to you right now, Lauren?" The question caught her completely off guard. She stared at me, confused. "What? What belongs to you right now?" She didn't answer because she couldn't. Nothing belonged to her, not legally, not morally, and not factually. Everything I owned still belonged to me, and that reality seemed to infuriate her. "I'm your daughter." "Yes, you are." The conversation paused. For a brief second, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her face. Then it vanished, replaced entirely by anger. "I've always been your beneficiary." An interesting choice of words. Beneficiary, not daughter and not family. Beneficiary. That distinction cut right to my heart. "You know," I said calmly, "when you were 8 years old, you used to tell people how proud you were to be my daughter." She rolled her eyes, actually rolled them again, just like she did at the retirement party. "We aren't talking about when I was 8 years old." "Right," I nodded. "We are talking about right now." The room grew quiet. Then Lauren leaned forward. "Did you give my inheritance to someone else?" The bluntness of it stunned me, not because she asked it, but because she completely skipped all the emotional steps in between. There was no concern, no curiosity, and no self-reflection, just a straight line to the inheritance. Suddenly, I understood something vital. This conversation had absolutely nothing to do with our relationship, at least from her perspective. It was entirely about the assets. Realizing that hurt far more than I expected. I looked her dead in the eye. "When exactly did you start viewing me as property?" The question hit like a physical blow. Her expression shifted instantly. "What? When did that happen?" "It didn't." "Then why is that your primary concern?" Silence followed. Another heavy, uncomfortable silence, the kind she couldn't easily escape. Instead of answering, she shifted her strategy. It was a classic move, and I recognized it immediately. Someone is influencing you. There it was. The accusation. I almost smiled because Daniel had predicted exactly this. Influencing me? Yeah, she said, crossing her arms. This doesn't sound like you at all. I nodded slowly. Why? Because you've always taken care of family. I'm still taking care of family. Then why would you do this? The answer was right there because I had spent weeks reflecting on it. Because taking care of family and enabling poor behavior are two completely different things. Those words hit their mark. I could see it in her face. Lauren snapped and stood right up. You think I'm a bad person? No. Then what do you think? I took a deep breath. I think you've become incredibly entitled. The air in the room completely froze. Nobody likes hearing the truth, especially when a part of them already suspects it. Lauren stared at me as if I had just slapped her across the face. Then her expression turned cold. What about Grace? Finally, the name surfaced. It was the first time she had mentioned her. Interesting. Very interesting. I kept my composure. What about her? I know she's involved in this somehow. The accusation sounded almost envious, possessive, and full of resentment. I wondered exactly how much digging she had done. Clearly not enough, but enough to make her worried. Grace has absolutely nothing to do with this conversation. She manipulated you. The claim was so absurd it made me laugh out loud. A short, genuine laugh. Grace manipulating me? The woman who had never asked me for a single thing, the one who thanked me repeatedly for a kindness she never expected. The contrast between Grace and Lauren felt completely suffocating. No, I shook my head, she didn't. Lauren's frustration escalated. You have no idea what you're doing. I stared right at her. Truly stared. For the first time in my life, I stopped seeing my daughter as a child. I saw an adult who needed to face the consequences of her choices, an adult who expected to receive things she hadn't earned, who believed love automatically translated into entitlement, and who mistook generosity for an absolute obligation. The realization was heartbreaking, but it was also incredibly clearing. Then, Lauren crossed a line I never anticipated she would cross. You've changed. I gave a bitter smile. You're exactly right. The admission seemed to surprise her because it was the absolute truth. I had changed, not into someone cruel, but into someone who was awake, someone who finally understood that boundaries aren't a punishment. They are protection. When she spoke again, her voice was even colder. If this is how things are going to be, I might need to have someone evaluate whether you're even capable of making these kinds of decisions anymore. The threat hung in the air, heavy, ugly, and unmistakable. I felt my heart sink. Not out of fear, but out of deep, profound disappointment. She was implying that I might be mentally unfit, not because she genuinely believed it, but because it might help her challenge my decisions. That realization shattered something inside me, the final illusion, the last excuse, and the remaining denial. In that exact moment, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Lauren wasn't just upset about the money anymore. She was willing to question my sanity just to regain control. What she didn't know was that I had already anticipated that exact possibility, and I had spent weeks preparing for it. The meeting took place 10 days later. By then, Lauren had calmed down and stopped making overt threats over the phone, at least not publicly. But Daniel Harper and I both knew things weren't over. Not by a long shot. That conversation at my house had shifted things permanently. The mask was slipping away, and once people reveal their true priorities, it's very difficult for them to hide them again. The meeting was actually Lauren's idea, not mine or Daniel's. Lauren had called, insisting that we needed to sit down and talk. She wanted answers, she wanted explanations, and above all, I suspected she wanted control. The location was set for Daniel's office, neutral ground, a professional setting where facts carried far more weight than emotions. When I arrived, Daniel was already waiting, and so was Lauren. To my surprise, Ethan was there too. The moment I saw him, I understood something. This wasn't just about me anymore. Something had shifted within their marriage as well, and the tension between them was impossible to ignore. Lauren sat rigidly in her chair, arms crossed and jaw clenched. Ethan sat right next to her, but there was a palpable distance between them, the kind of emotional distance that forms when trust begins to break down. Daniel greeted everyone and closed the conference room door. Then he took his seat. For several minutes, nobody said a word. Finally, Lauren broke the silence. Let's stop pretending. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Pretending what? Right, she said, looking directly at me. I want to know exactly what is going on here. I remained perfectly calm. Okay. My simple response seemed to frustrate her. Okay? Yes, I folded my hands. What exactly do you want to know? She narrowed her eyes. Why did you do this? The exact same question again, only now we were sitting in an attorney's office instead of my living room. Somehow the answer felt even clearer than before. I am making decisions regarding my estate. No, Lauren shook her head. I mean, why are you punishing me? Punishing. An interesting choice of words. I looked over at Daniel, then back at Lauren. Do you truly view this as a punishment? Yes, the answer came out immediately, too fast, as if she had rehearsed it. I nodded slowly, then reached into my bag. Lauren watched curiously while Daniel remained silent. I pulled out a few printed pages, ordinary sheets of paper, nothing dramatic or complex, just evidence. The first page was a screenshot of a text message, the one asking about the original deed to the cabin. The second page contained another conversation, asking about account ownership, asset transfers, and paperwork, one question after another, a repeating pattern. I placed the pages on the table. Lauren's expression shifted instantly, not into panic but recognition. She knew exactly what she was looking at. I don't understand. Her voice sounded noticeably weaker now. You don't understand, I said, keeping my voice entirely calm. The timeline here seems very clear. Lauren glanced at Ethan, then looked back at me. These are just normal questions, Mom. Maybe, I nodded. I slid another printed page across the table, followed by the next and the next. Timelines, dates, messages, and conversations. The whole picture was right there. It detailed her suddenly surging interest in my financial situation over the past several weeks, the increasingly specific questions, and the written record of her behavior. I hadn't prepared these notes for a courtroom. I had put them together for myself just to be absolutely certain I wasn't imagining things or letting emotion distort reality. Now, the black and white truth sat directly between us. Lauren's frustration began to resurface. You are making this look so much worse than it actually is. Before I could answer, Ethan spoke up. It was the first time he had opened his mouth since the meeting started. Are these messages wrong, Lauren? The room completely froze. Lauren turned to look at him in absolute shock. It was genuine disbelief because she had expected his unconditional support, not interrogation. Ethan, don't. His voice remained steady, almost painfully quiet. Answer the question. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Lauren let out a nervous chuckle. This is completely ridiculous. But Ethan wasn't laughing. He didn't smile and he didn't look away. He just waited. Suddenly, everything clicked. This was definitely not the first time they had discussed this issue. Not at all. The underlying tension I had noticed between them earlier made perfect sense now. The rift had started long before today. It was just finally being brought out into the open. Daniel remained silent, observing the room with a practiced, watchful eye. Finally, Lauren spoke. I was just trying to be helpful. Ethan nodded slowly. Maybe you were. His response surprised everyone, including me, because it wasn't an accusation. It was just absolute honesty. Then he continued, But at some point, Lauren, I think you stopped listening to how you actually sound. Those words landed with immense weight. Lauren stared at him, stunned. You think I'm a bad person? No, his voice softened. I think your focus is entirely in the wrong place. The room felt smaller, tighter, and far more emotional. For the first time, someone other than me was saying the hard things that desperately needed to be said. There was no cruelty or anger in his voice, just absolute candor. Tears instantly welled up in Lauren's eyes, but they were different this time. They weren't tears of grief or remorse. They were tears of pure frustration, the frustration of losing an argument. It wasn't the pain of realization, at least not yet. Then she snapped, turning her focus back to me. You've been talking about me behind my back. The accusation caught me off guard because it couldn't have been further from the truth. No, Lauren, you are the one who has clearly been discussing things with other people. I shook my head. That's not true. For the first time in several minutes, Daniel stepped in. Lauren! She looked over at him. Your mother didn't have to tell anyone anything. Silence fell over the room. Daniel lightly tapped the printed pages on the desk. This information speaks entirely for itself. Those words carried a heavy truth. It was a painful reality that required no explanation, no manipulation, and no exaggeration. It was simply her own words, her own questions, and her own priorities staring right back at her. The room remained dead quiet. Then, something entirely unexpected happened. Ethan reached into his briefcase, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and placed it firmly on the table. "What is that?" Lauren asked. His expression was filled with sadness, disappointment, and pure exhaustion. I read the letters. The memory box, the letters, the exact gift she had dismissed as junk. Lauren looked completely bewildered. What does that have to do with any of this? It has to do with everything, Lauren. This is the entire point. Ethan looked her directly in the eye. Because I finally understand what your mother was actually trying to give you. The silence that followed felt a century long. I could barely breathe. It wasn't because of the conflict, but because someone finally understood. Someone truly saw it. Ethan continued, his voice remaining steady. You thought she was handing over a piece of property, but she was giving you herself. Those words struck a chord with every single person in the room, including Lauren. Especially Lauren. For the very first time since this entire ordeal began, I saw uncertainty replace her anger. It was fleeting, but it was there, a tiny crack in her defense. Lauren's gaze drifted back down to the documents, looking at the evidence of a reality she could no longer dismiss. Then, something shifted. It wasn't a total transformation, but it was enough. For the first time, she stopped fighting, stopped defending herself, and stopped making excuses. She just sat there in total silence. In that quiet moment, I realized something vital. My goal had never been to humiliate her, and it was never about revenge. It was simply about bringing the truth to light. And the truth had finally filled the room. Whether Lauren chose to accept it was no longer in my control, but she heard it, and everyone else did too. As the meeting drew to a close, a strange feeling came over me. The real consequences were just beginning. They weren't legal consequences, but deeply personal ones. The kind that follow you home, the kind that wait for you in the mirror, and the kind that force you to ask if you've become someone you no longer recognize. The weeks following that meeting in Daniel Harper's office were incredibly quiet. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, but a heavy stillness. There is a big difference between the two. Peace comes from resolution, while stillness often comes from avoidance. Lauren was avoiding things. Maybe she was avoiding me, maybe herself, or maybe just the uncomfortable truths that had surfaced during that meeting. Whatever the reason, our communication practically vanished. The daily phone calls stopped, the constant questions disappeared, and her sudden interest in my paperwork evaporated. For the first time in months, my phone remained completely silent. A part of me felt a massive wave of relief, but another part felt a profound sadness. Because regardless of what had happened, Lauren was still my daughter. I couldn't just wake up one morning and stop loving her. That isn't how motherhood works, at least not for me. The love remained, but the trust was entirely gone. Learning to separate those two things became one of the hardest lessons of my life. A few days after the meeting, Ethan called. He didn't call to talk about money or legal matters, he just wanted to see how I was holding up. "How have you been doing lately, Monica?" he asked. The question felt almost foreign. So many of my recent conversations had revolved entirely around conflict, and his simple kindness caught me off guard. "I'm doing okay, Ethan." "Genuinely?" I smiled slightly, for the most part. He let out a soft chuckle. "That's probably the most honest answer anyone can give." We ended up talking for nearly an hour about Noah, retirement, and life in general. Eventually, the conversation naturally turned to Lauren. "She's really struggling right now," Ethan admitted. I looked out the kitchen window. Late autumn had arrived, and fallen leaves covered a large portion of the yard. The season felt remarkably fitting. Things were changing, things were ending, and things were preparing for something completely new. "What kind of struggle?" A long pause followed before Ethan answered carefully. "I think she's finally starting to realize how bad this all looks." Those words circled in my mind. How things looked wasn't the real issue. The facts were. Still, I understood what he meant. For perhaps the first time in her life, Lauren was being forced to view her own behavior through the eyes of others. That experience can be incredibly painful, especially when the reflection in the mirror isn't a pleasant one. A week later, I met up with Patricia for lunch. We sat outside a small cafe overlooking a local park. Children were playing nearby and dogs were chasing tennis balls. No matter how dramatic our personal lives felt, normal life kept moving forward right around us. Patricia listened as I caught her up on everything. Then she asked a single question. "Do you regret it?" I knew exactly what she was asking about. The will, the boundaries, the confrontation, all of it. I thought about it carefully, then shook my head. "No, I don't." She smiled. "Good. But I do deeply regret that it had to become a necessary step." That answer felt much closer to the truth because I had never wanted any of this. I never wanted the conflict, and I never wanted the estrangement. I never wanted my daughter to question my decisions or threaten my judgment. All I had ever wanted was simple respect, understanding, and love. The fact that those things had become so incredibly complicated still broke my heart. A few days later, something entirely unexpected happened. Grace invited me to a community fundraising event, a scholarship benefit for nursing students. The coincidence wasn't lost on either of us, and I accepted immediately. The event was wonderful. It was filled with young nurses and future caregivers, a room full of purpose and hope. For the first time in a very long time, I felt alive, valued, and connected. Several students shared stories of their financial struggles and the dreams they were working so hard to afford. Listening to them confirmed something vital. The decisions I made regarding my estate were not born out of anger. They were rooted firmly in my core values. That distinction brought me a continuous sense of peace. Near the end of the event, Grace pulled me aside. "There's something I want to tell you." Her smile looked a bit nervous. "What is it, Grace?" "I got the promotion." The pure pride in her voice instantly brought a smile to my face. "Grace, that's absolutely incredible. Congratulations." She beamed. "I wanted you to be the very first person to know." Those words hit me unexpectedly. It wasn't because of the promotion itself, but because she wanted to share it with me first. There were no financial motives, no hidden requests, and no expectations. It was just a moment of genuine gratitude, a real connection, shared simply because she cared. Driving home that night, I found myself thinking about the concept of family all over again. Not bloodlines and not inheritances, but real family. The people who celebrate your victories, the ones who show up when things get difficult, and the ones who value you as a person rather than what you own. That thought stayed with me for days. Then, nearly 3 weeks after the meeting, a letter arrived in the mail. It was handwritten and completely unexpected, with a return address belonging to Lauren. I stared at the envelope for several minutes before opening it, my hands actually shaking. It wasn't because I was afraid of what was inside, but because I still held on to hope. Even after endless disappointments, hope can be a dangerous thing, especially after disappointment. Eventually, I opened it. Inside was a 3-page letter. I read every single word slowly, and then I read it all over again. Lauren apologized. It wasn't a perfect apology, and it wasn't entirely complete, but it was genuine, at least far more genuine than anything I had received from her in months. She admitted that her focus had been entirely in the wrong place, and she acknowledged that she had taken far too many assumptions for granted. She also admitted that she had gone back and read more of the letters inside the memory box. That part of the letter immediately caught my attention. One letter in particular, the one about Michael, her father, the exact letter she hadn't bothered to read before. According to Lauren, that letter had moved her to tears. After reading it, I sat in silence for a long time, unsure of exactly how to feel. Hopeful, cautious, sad, and relieved. A mix of every emotion all at once. The apology couldn't erase everything. That was impossible. Trust cannot be rebuilt overnight. But it mattered, because taking accountability matters, putting in the effort matters, and growth matters. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. It was Lauren. For a few seconds, I just stared at the screen before answering. "Hello." Silence filled the line. Then a quiet, "Hi, Mom." Her voice sounded completely different. Softer, smaller, and remarkably vulnerable. The conversation that followed wasn't magical. There were no dramatic speeches or instant fixes. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, there was pure honesty. Awkward honesty, painful honesty, and entirely necessary honesty. She apologized again, and I listened. I accepted her apology, but I didn't instantly restore everything back to the way it was. Surprisingly, she didn't ask me to either. That detail meant more than any words she could have spoken. Because for the first time in a very long time, our conversation wasn't about inheritances, ownership, or future assets. It was entirely about us, a mother and a daughter working to repair a deep rift between them. When the call ended, I felt something unfamiliar. Possibility. The possibility that Lauren might actually learn something valuable from all of this. The possibility that people can change when they are willing to face uncomfortable truths. And the possibility that healing was still within reach. But healing doesn't mean forgetting, and it certainly doesn't mean letting go of boundaries. Those lessons had cost me far too much to ever give up. Very soon, Lauren and I would have one final conversation. A conversation about the memory box, the will, love, and the profound difference between an inheritance and a legacy. A distinction she was only just beginning to truly understand. 3 weeks after Lauren's letter arrived, we met at the lakeside cabin. The cabin had somehow become the ultimate symbol of all the conflict between us. For months, it had represented ownership, inheritance expectations, and deep rifts. Before our story came to a close, I wanted it to represent something else entirely: understanding. The drive north was quiet and incredibly peaceful. The trees were dressed in deep autumn colors, and the lake looked like a sheet of polished glass reflecting the gray morning sky. I arrived first, not out of impatience, but because I needed a few moments of absolute solitude. The cabin had always been my sanctuary, a place where life slowed down, the noise faded away, and it was much easier to hear the truth. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The familiar scent of cedar immediately welcomed me, followed closely by a rush of memories. Family weekends, summer cookouts, and Noah fishing off the dock. Quiet evenings spent reading by the fireplace. This place held the pieces of my life. Maybe that was why I had protected it so fiercely. It wasn't about its material value, but its profound meaning. About 20 minutes later, Lauren arrived. She walked in slowly, looking visibly nervous. For the first time in a very long time, she looked entirely uncertain. No defenses and no anger. Just uncertainty. That difference was vital. We shared a simple hug. There was no drama to it, but it felt like a genuine fresh start. We sat down at the kitchen table, the exact same spot where I had once envisioned future family gatherings. For several minutes, neither of us said a word. Then, Lauren broke the silence. "I've been reading the letters, Mom." I offered a gentle smile. "All of them?" She nodded her head 3 separate times. Emotion tightened in my chest. It wasn't just because she had finally read them, but because she finally understood why they existed in the first place. Her eyes welled with tears. "I didn't see it before," she said softly. It was a broken, painful kind of honesty. "I know." "No," she shook her head. "You don't understand." I stayed quiet, allowing her to keep going. "I thought I knew your life," she said, looking down at the table. "But I only knew the easy version." Those words were heavy, but they brought a sense of healing because it was the absolute truth. For decades, I had hidden the difficult parts, the sacrifices, the loneliness, the fear, and the pure exhaustion. I had protected Lauren from those realities, and in doing so, I had inadvertently hidden the true cost of love itself. Lauren wiped her eyes. The letter about college completely broke me. I remembered that letter perfectly. The one describing how I often skipped dinner just to ensure her tuition was paid. The one about the second job, the overtime, and the fears I had never shared with a single soul. I had absolutely no idea. "I know, Lauren." Silence fell over the room again, but it wasn't an uncomfortable stillness. It was a healing quiet, the kind that happens when people finally stop defending themselves and simply start to listen. Eventually, Lauren spoke up again. I became someone I don't even like. The candor surprised me, not because it wasn't true, but because she was finally willing to say it out loud. "I got way too comfortable," she gave a bitter smile. "Maybe that's the gentlest way to put it." I didn't say a word. This wasn't my confession, it was hers. She continued, "I just started making assumptions." The word assumptions hung heavily in the air, accurate and telling. "I assumed the house would eventually be mine." I nodded slowly. "I assumed the cabin would be mine." I nodded again. "I assumed everything would just be mine." There it was. The truth was finally spoken out loud, completely uncovered, with no disguises and no packaging like practicality, planning, or convenience. Just the raw truth. Lauren looked me directly in the eyes. "And the worst part is, Mom, I stopped seeing you as a real person." My eyes instantly filled with tears because that sentence encapsulated everything, every argument, every misunderstanding, and every single painful moment. She hadn't stopped loving me, at least not entirely. She had simply stopped seeing me. She stopped viewing me as an individual, a woman, a mother, and a living human being. Instead, I had gradually become a line item in her future plans, a part of her assumptions, and a piece of her expectations. Along the way, she forgot that I was still alive, still feeling, still growing, and still making choices of my own. The realization clearly broke her down entirely. Remarkably, it hurt me far less than I thought it would, because watching someone take real accountability changes everything. It doesn't fix things instantly, but its impact is profound. After a long silence, Lauren asked the question I knew was bound to come. What happens now? I smiled gently. The answer had become perfectly clear. Now? She nodded. Now we move forward. Confusion flashed across her face. Just like that? I chuckled. What were you expecting? I don't know, her voice caught. Maybe for you to tell me that I ruined everything. The pure sadness in her expression broke my heart. Because despite everything that had happened, she was still my daughter, and I still loved her deeply. No, I reached across the table and took her hand in mine. You hurt me, Lauren. She nodded, I know. But hurting me and losing me are two completely different things. Those words seemed to overwhelm her, and tears flowed freely down her cheeks. For a long time she couldn't speak. When she finally managed to find her voice, it was barely a whisper. I am so sorry, Mom. For the very first time, I believed every single word. It wasn't just driven by passing emotion. It was driven by genuine growth. The apology didn't sound like damage control. It sounded like true understanding. There is a massive divide between the two. A huge difference. After a moment, I stood up and walked over to a nearby shelf where the memory box sat waiting quietly. The exact box that had started this entire journey, the object she had once dismissed so easily, and the item that had ultimately taught us both a vital lesson. I brought it back to the table and placed it right in front of her. Lauren stared at it, almost afraid to touch it. Mom, I smiled. Take it. New tears filled her eyes, reflecting a mix of deep emotion, realized connection, and profound gratitude. The letters, the photos inside. Yes, those too, I said, lightly resting my hand on the wooden lid. Every single item in this box represents a lifetime spent loving you. Neither of us spoke for a few seconds. Then I shared one final truth. A will is not my legacy, Lauren. She looked up at me. Money is not my legacy. Silence. The house is not my legacy. An even longer pause. I placed my hand firmly over hers. You are. In that exact moment, she completely broke down. It wasn't an outburst of hysteria, but a quiet, deep sobbing. The kind that happens when someone finally realizes exactly what they almost lost. We sat together for a long time after that, talking, remembering, and beginning to heal. It didn't resolve every single issue instantly. Healing doesn't work that way. It requires time, patience, and absolute consistency. But for the first time in a very long time, we were moving in the right direction. As the afternoon sun reflected off the lake outside the window, one final realization came to me. The absolute greatest gift I could ever leave my daughter wasn't money, property, or even simple forgiveness. It was giving her the opportunity to become a better version of herself. And finally, she was entirely ready to accept it. If this entire experience has taught me anything, it's that love and entitlement can sometimes wear remarkably similar masks. As parents, many of us spend decades making endless sacrifices for our children. We work longer hours, put our own dreams on hold, and quietly carry heavy burdens they may never fully comprehend. We do it gladly because love often demands that we give without keeping score. But there is a distinct line between giving and completely surrendering. There is a massive difference between supporting someone and teaching them to view your sacrifices as an absolute obligation. For many years, I believed that loving my daughter meant saying yes to absolutely everything. I thought it meant protecting her from every disappointment, constantly overlooking her mistakes, and prioritizing her desires far above my own needs. What I eventually learned is that healthy love requires firm boundaries. Boundaries are not a form of punishment. They are an expression of self-respect. And self-respect is something every single person deserves, regardless of their age. Another vital lesson I learned is that gratitude matters infinitely more than an inheritance. Money can be spent, property can be sold, and physical assets can vanish into thin air. But gratitude shapes true character. A grateful heart values people far more than possessions, while an entitled mindset operates in the exact opposite way. The greatest legacy we leave behind doesn't exist in a bank account or a legal document. It lives on in the lives we touch, the genuine kindness we show, and the core values we pass down to the people we love. I also learned that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. Forgiving means releasing the pain while still honoring the lessons you learned along the way. You can completely forgive someone and still maintain your boundaries. You can love someone deeply and still expect them to do better. Above all, I learned that it is never too late to grow. It's never too late for a parent, it's never too late for a child, and it's never too late for a family. Sometimes, the hardest conversations become the exact starting point for true healing. And sometimes, the things we initially value the least turn out to be the most precious things we could ever own. If this story touched your heart, I would truly love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever felt completely taken for granted by someone you love deeply? Or have you ever realized that your own focus had shifted to the wrong things in life? Please share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might provide real comfort or guidance to someone else going through a similar situation. If you appreciate these moving family stories with deep life lessons, please take a quick moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows these narratives to keep reaching the people who need them most. Before you go, let me know where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. I always love reading through your comments and connecting with viewers from all over the globe. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. And please always remember, the most valuable legacy we leave behind is never the things we own.